Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WAP seminar series. WAP equips leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. We're thrilled to virtually gather today to welcome William P. Gibson. But before I introduce him, I'd like to go over a few functionalities and housekeeping rules. We're joined with my Gender and Public Policy seminar class, the HKS community, and other welcome guests. I'm going to ask William some questions and conduct an informal interview for about the first 35 to 40 minutes. And we ask you to change your view to speaker view. It's at the top right-hand corner of your screen, which will toggle back and forth between myself and William, depending on who's speaking at the time. Once we conclude the interview, we will move into the Q&A segment. The first questions will be by my seminar class, followed by others in the room, and there are about 50 of you. So if you have a question, we ask you to virtually raise your hand, which is under the Participants tab. By raising your hand virtually, this will allow the question to be sent to the moderator, Katie, who will ask it in order received. We ask you to limit questions in the chats if possible. It's just more difficult to get to. So we'll try to get through as many questions as the time allows. And again, I hope to conclude relatively early to leave at least half an hour for questions from the audience. So without further ado, allow me to introduce William P. Gibson. We'll be having a conversation with him. He is the former Chief Diversity Officer at Procter & Gamble. William retired on June 30th from P&G after 34 years of innovation leadership as President of Enterprise Packaging Transformation and as the Chief Diversity Officer. William is a native of Montgomery, Alabama, and he served in the United States Air Force from 1976 to 1980. He received a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Alabama in 1984. He sits on the boards of the National Action Council for Minorities in Engineering and the Cincinnati Scholarship Foundation, and he's also a member of the Cincinnati Business Committee Education Task Force. We welcome WAP's podcast community as well, which has downloaded our seminars over 54,000 times. And we're pleased to have this rippling impact beyond the virtual walls of the room that we're in now. So we thank you for everyone who handles that side of the communications. So without further ado, I'm going to begin the interview with Mr. Gibson. So William, to start off, can you tell us a little bit about your personal and professional background and how you got into diversity and inclusion work? It looks like you have quite a diverse background. So if you could give us a little bit of your trajectory and how you got to where you were, that would be wonderful.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here today. And it's been a while since I've retired, so just June of last year. This year has gone by very, very quickly, and I'm enjoying every moment of retirement. But prior to retirement, I did indeed spend 34 years with Procter & Gamble. As you noted, I'm from Montgomery, Alabama originally. I'm one of 9 kids, and I'm the middle kid of that group. So I'm symmetrically middle. I have 3 older sisters, 3 younger sisters, 1 older brother, 1 younger brother. So I'm symmetric in that regard. After high school, I joined the Air Force, as you noted as well. I did that because at the time of graduating high school, I thought I wanted to play Division I football. And unfortunately, I wasn't as good as I thought I was. And you measure that by the number of recruiting visits that you go on. And coming from Montgomery and being the first to even consider college in my family, all the requirements for higher education wasn't something that we talked about. I had great grades only because I was competitive in high school and wanted to compete with my buddies on tougher courses. But I didn't know and didn't think about anything outside of football as my pathway to college. So I wasn't really mentally prepared to go in, so I joined the Air Force instead. Spent 4 years working on fighter airplanes, got to see the world. In fact, the first time I flew on a plane was going to basic training. Okay. And the world began to open up for me during those 4 years. So I am one of those who say that the military helped me mature and helped me grow really quickly. A lot of responsibility very fast. Luckily, I was dating a girl at the time, and her family actually talked about higher education. And I was at a dinner event at her home, and her mother asked the question, "What are you going to do?" And I mentioned that I was in the Air Force, but she wasn't really impressed with that. Her body language signaled that to me. So I had to think quickly on my feet. And I told her, well, I want to finish 4 years and I will go back to college. Then she perked up and she asked me the next question, go back to college for what? And I had no clue. But luckily, my 11th grade chemistry teacher in high school had convinced me to go to the University of Alabama to check out their engineering program. And so my memory kicked in and I said, engineering. And she said, which engineering? And because it was chemistry class, I said chemical engineering. Consequently, that was a commitment, a verbal commitment that I made to her that I continued with once I got out. And luckily, I finished and then started with Procter & Gamble immediately after graduation. I started out in R&D. I spent most of my career working in R&D, first in baby diapers, then various categories, tissue towel, which for some reason right now is one of the most popular categories in the US and the world, toilet paper, who knew? I went on to work in the beauty care sector, and then someplace towards the last 7 years of my career with P&G, they asked me to also pick up diversity. In addition to leading innovation in R&D, they wanted someone who actually understood the business operation side of it to also attack and try to solve this matter in this situation around diversity. So I brought with me into this role all of the innovation, all of the experimentation, all of that type of thinking. And by being a business person before, it actually gave me more credibility to speak to the other leadership team about how to move this platform forward. So it enabled me to actually push harder to take examples of experiments and run those experiments within the business units that I worked in to show evidence that they were successful and then grow them across the company. I'm married, been married for many years. I have 3 kids, a daughter who lives in New Jersey, she's married, and then 2 sons, who one works now for Procter & Gamble as of January, and the other is finding his pathway. Okay, so that's the best way I can say it at this point in time. And hopefully he will arrive at his pathway sooner versus later. So yeah, that's who I am.
Well, it sounds like you had a very circuitous path to your eventual golden destination. And I think it's the first time in my life I've heard a story of someone stumbling into a chemical engineering degree. Which is quite remarkable, and I think a testament to your adaptability if you can just sort of stumble matter-of-factly and successfully finish a chemical engineering degree. That's pretty impressive. So let's segue and talk a little bit about your actual challenges and experiences in working in D&I at Procter & Gamble. So in your experience, what is one of the biggest hurdles that you've had in implementing strategy or diversity policy within that organization, and what are some of the more effective ways that you've been able to get buy-in from people who have been resistant to some of the efforts that you've attempted to and policies that you've attempted to implement at P&G?
Diversity has and will continue to be a challenge simply because of the nature of what it's about. And you're trying to deal with the subject of how people come together and how people work, how people relate to one another, how they don't relate to one another. How do you extract value from one another? How do you give someone a fair opportunity to actually compete? Okay, so diversity deals with human DNA. Okay, we basically do everything socially based on liking someone or being familiar with someone or understanding what to expect from a group. And our DNA coding is such that we avoid dynamics and situations where we feel we're, for some reason, whatever the reason is, at risk. And we assimilate with folks like us, largely for safety reasons. And those reasons, and I'm not a biologist, I'm not a social scientist, I'm just a guy who runs experiments and have these life experiences. So I'm speaking from that vantage point. So the most difficult part for within a corporate relationship is first making it relevant to the folks that you're trying to affect. Folks who are going to, in fact, impart change. And then understanding what their role historically has been and what their position is on this whole subject matter. There's lots of fear associated with this, and the fear usually stems from someone feeling that they're going to be called out because they're somewhat deficit in this area. And frankly, we're all deficit. But some folks are more apt to being curious about their deficiencies. Others are more protective of where they currently sit. And companies and corporations are positioned to want to do the right thing and more reluctant to talk about the things they're not good at. So in my opening, you mentioned that I sort of stumbled into the engineering area. There are very few folks that I've come across that would be willing to self-acknowledge their stumbles. Most of us want to glorify our successes. Corporations are no different than that because they're made up of people. So this subject of diversity is sort of difficult to tackle because it speaks to vulnerabilities that we all have. And these vulnerabilities deal with our inability to deal with differences, our inability to embrace those differences, our unwillingness to stumble and make mistakes, particularly in areas of high stress and high concern. So the biggest thing to constantly overcome, and it's not like anyone has ever been able to overcome it on a grand scale, is to bring people into positions of more comfort so that they can actually explore their vulnerabilities and be willing to talk from those vulnerabilities, as opposed to protecting any delving into their weaknesses. And then corporations, lastly, they're designed to protect the enterprise. So understanding, I had to stumble through understanding the role of legal as it relates to this subject matter, the role of PR as it relates to this, and importantly, the role of HR, which HR can be and should be the biggest ally for this work. And at times across different corporations, at different personalities is leading it, it can become a serious impediment to get the work done. So understanding the various components of a corporation, who's there to do what, and then working your way through all of that becomes hurdles that you have to maneuver around.
Mm-hmm. So I like what you've said, because it's really rich. You've talked about making diversity relevant. You've talked about managing fear and vulnerability, and you've talked about protecting the enterprise. I want to sort of build on that last point and ask you whether you think D&I efforts can ever truly move beyond the business case, or do you think that we can reframe diversity and inclusion in a way that capitalizes on reasons and motivations for embracing diversity from an enterprise standpoint that don't rest solely on the business case? You happen to be in a business, in an industry, Procter & Gamble, where everyone uses their products. Everybody uses toilet paper. Everybody uses Tide laundry detergent, right? So diversity is really key because they're still selling the products to a broad diversity of people in not just the United States, but in the world, because it's also a very international business. But what about Goldman Sachs, or what about other companies that can make the case that they could do just fine with wealthy white people as their clients, and so how would you sell it, the need, the sort of importance of diversity to an industry that doesn't have the natural sort of demographic demands that a company like Procter & Gamble would?
Yeah, there are going to be multiple approaches that anyone needs to have in their quiver to be able to tackle this, because as I talked about, you're dealing with discomfort. And what is it about an individual? What is it about industries? What is it about whatever you're trying to affect? How do you get them to think differently, act differently, behave differently? So the notion of it moving to any set position, by definition, limits you. So having the ability to understand where someone's sitting and then craft an argument to actually grab their attention, to get them to move into this place of vulnerability, becomes the critical thing. So companies now, you're beginning to see, and you have seen, more and more companies find this idea of being good for growth. Okay, so a force for good and a force for growth is the way that Procter & Gamble termed it. That I see lots of companies now doing that. And as I speak to this, I don't want to speak to this from the angle of one company doing it better or one company doing it worse. That was an important thing for me to also learn, that I needed to speak of it in terms of we're all in this journey and we all need to share openly. So this idea of using diversity as a competitive advantage needs to be squashed. because none of us are doing it well. So how do we in fact share? So the idea of the business case, let's talk about the business case as it relates to that. In your argument around the financial industry, there is a business argument for them as well. Okay. Their part of their reason for being is in fact to create communities where the financial engine of that community is in fact thriving. And as more folks move back into urban settings, they are in fact being impacted by who was in those urban settings before. And those urban settings oftentimes were poor folks, communities that actually needs revitalization. As they move more globally, they're also confronted with this theme of who, in fact, they can reach from with their monetary tools. Okay. So whatever business, and then the whole internet has opened up many different avenues of finance and commerce for groups of people who weren't in fact included. But getting capital in the hands of folks who don't have access to capital, most of the big financial institutions are trying to figure that out. They're also trying to attract people who will be graduating from your class, hopefully soon. And these folks are asking very different questions of these institutions today than they were when I was in school. They are demanding, where do you stand on social issues that matter to me? Okay. And if you cannot show relevance there, some of the top kids from some of the top universities are walking away. So now if you're a CEO and you're meeting with your new set of whoever it is, MBA students, engineers, whoever it is, and you cannot speak to them from this position, you will not attract them to your enterprise. So the business case for them becomes one of, how do I get commerce to places where we have not been successful in the past? How do I make sure that the communities and environment where my offices are, and where my people are congregating, that they're healthy and vibrant? How do I attract and retain new talent for tomorrow that's going to insist that I correct things that we missed in the past? So there's different angles that you make it relevant to whoever's within a company to make the case for, why does it matter to you? And why does it matter to you today more than it did when you were new? And then giving them permission to stumble and make mistakes along the path.
Yeah. So I think that's a great answer, and clearly you get this, and clearly this is important to you, and I think you've made a compelling case for why it should be important to all businesses, even businesses that may not see the obvious case for diversity. So my next question is, how do you convince power holders within your organization? And one of the specific questions from one of my students is, what is the most effective way to convince white males to support and champion diversity and inclusion if they may not understand or buy what you're saying about the business case? And feel free to use some of your own personal examples, because I'm sure in your many years at Procter & Gamble, you've run up against resistance. And how did you effectively deal with getting people to buy the business case that you so eloquently laid out, and to get them on board as allies for this mission in the service of increasing what you call doing good and growth within the organization? So what are some of the ways that people can do that? Because we all get it who are in this room, but how do we communicate the importance of this to people who may not get it?
Yeah, there are tools out there that will work again for some groups of folks and not for others. The whole idea that actually was born out of Harvard with Dr. Banaji and unconscious bias, basically reframed the subject matter to say we all have biases. So it basically reduced something that was emotional into something that's logical. And I'm going to basically stereotype a group of folks, men, and say most of them think of themselves as being logical. I also know that a lot of them are highly emotional as well. But let's just give them the benefit of the doubt today and say that men are logical. Well, unconscious bias basically gave them a logical rationale on why this whole subject of diversity has been difficult for them. And then they can begin to see themselves in it. And because it gives them tools to work on themselves, now that you have identified this logical impediment, they can begin to attack it. So unconscious bias has its place. But then I found that even that gets to an intellectual point, but it doesn't move them into necessary action. And so one of the tools I've used is I have allowed different cuts of the organization to tell their own stories to leadership. Because what I found that in my role as Chief Diversity Officer, I was often protecting the enterprise inadvertently away from the population at large. So when young people collectively start telling their stories and the experiences that they have within a company or within any enterprise, if you are a leader who cares about your organization, those stories are hard to walk beyond. Okay? It's hard to walk beyond when you have someone and the way that they present their argument as a young person and as a middle manager and as a senior manager, you see consistency in those things. It becomes hard for you to walk away from it because you see yourself as someone who's leading an organization who doesn't have this problem. So we use a technique called the fishbowl, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But it was an inverted fishbowl where the leadership sat in the dark around the corner or around the edges, and then the target group sat in the middle. And the leadership couldn't, in fact, ask any questions or give any anecdotes to what's going on. They had to listen. Invariably, during a discussion, the group in the center basically lost sight of who was on the outside. So the stories became real. And these were, again, young folks, like less than 5 years, people in the middle, somewhere, under 20 years, and then more senior leaders, 30 years. Each group, when you basically summarize what they had to say, basically told some of the stories, which said that this is an inherent issue. And now leadership now is left with doing something about it. So after that exercise, Procter & Gamble made a step change. And I've seen other companies make a step change as well, going through a tool like that, in the way that they approached it externally. So this whole idea of a force for good or force for growth. And you may have seen things like The Talk, which was a piece of copy that P&G ran, and other pieces of copy for LGBTQ, other pieces of copy for women, We See Equal, began to populate the networks. And then other companies also were doing similar, and some of the companies have taken it even further. But it's because they were moved emotionally by not being protected, by not hearing the stories of issues and conflicts from a senior member, by not making it feel like it was self-serving for me to tell the story. They begin to hear directly from the people that they care about in the organization, the generational similarity across it all. And then they begin to move. So multiple tools designed to get after a group of people who are showing a lack of awareness or lack of urgency to move on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm going to just ask a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. You seem to know a lot now, William, and not just in terms of knowledge and intelligence, but also wisdom. You can sort of sense that.
You're generous.
No, and I've told you that before talking to you on the phone, because I deal with a lot of chief diversity officers, and there's a certain wisdom that you have. But my question is, what is one thing that you wish you had known before you had any wisdom when you first started this work? What is something that you wish you had known that you didn't know that you think is important for people doing this sort of work to know?
Yeah, there are going to be two things that's top of mind. I've already mentioned one, and it was the role that certain areas of the company, what their role is in this particular space, and what they're being chartered to protect. Okay, I came into that and I was very naive about that piece. Okay, I thought that the idea of a chief diversity officer and what that meant, and not just a diversity officer, but this whole space, I didn't know that it was self-divided, and I don't think anyone sat down and intentionally self-divided it, but I didn't realize it was self-divided the way that it was. That the groups that I talked about, communications, HR, legal, and I would even say finance with certain points, because the risk financially of talking about a vulnerability of an enterprise when enterprises need to show that they're all buttoned up to give confidence to the outside markets that they're where they need to be, really creates dynamics where it's difficult to get to truth, difficult to get to the facts, where we really stand, and then to share those facts with others who can actually help you get better. Had I known that coming in, I would have made far better progress earlier on by bringing those organizations along on the journey. Okay, and I got there later than I should have. The second piece that I likely learned later than I wish I had was this sense of not competing with other companies in this particular domain, so that I can in fact learn from them and share best practices and do more experimentation across different industries, across the different sectors. Mm-hmm. We held at hostage so long our best practices because we actually saw them as a competitive advantage from a recruiting standpoint and others. And in fact, acknowledging publicly that we are open for business and we want to bring others along created more of a social movement in this space that actually now I see some tenets of that still being populated and pushed out, that I wish I'd come into the role earlier, recognizing this is not a place where we should be competing with one another because we all have these deficits. It's a human factor. We should be collaborating more. So those two things, one internal and organization and how you affect it, and then the external is not competing the way that we competed before. Yeah, great. So my last question, and then we'll open it up to the attendees. And this is about sharing, I guess, best practices or exporting best practices across sectors. Most of your experience, though not all of it, because you spent a few years in the military, but the vast majority of your professional experience has been in the private sector. What are some lessons or approaches to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the private sector that you think could be transferred to the public sector? Do they transfer, or is it a different challenge in the private sector versus the public sector? P&G is not an organization that lacks resources. There's perhaps more freedom to change and implement policy than there would be in a large federal bureaucracy. So what are some of the challenges that you see or some of the things that you think will translate or generalize from the private sector to people in the virtual room who may be in the public sector wondering, how can I move the needle on D&I? What would you recommend? Yeah, first of all, because they're both made of people and this is a human issue more than anything else, you basically have the same dynamics and fundamentals happening there. You have different barriers, different organizational protection mechanisms at play in the public sector than you do in the private sector. But fundamentally, they're about people, and if you are a university professor, you have the same type of business metrics as anyone else to actually grow your university. Okay? And if you're not doing that, then you're not going to exist at some point in time. If you're a government official, if your contingency and your communities are in fact really doing a great job of letting you know what's needed and what misses are happening, and if you are a good person at heart and good business and community leader, then in fact you would in fact want to embrace this as well. So the human factor is going to be one and the same. The urgency to tackle it can in fact be different. The roadblocks and barriers and regulations and all that could be in fact different as well. What I am seeing in this space is if you go to a big diversity seminar, you will find that there are as many private sector folks there as there are public sector folks. Companies are in fact sharing more, so putting more corporate folks on private boards, okay, on public boards. You see that happening. I see places where there are in fact government agents on in fact public boards and private boards. So and I don't mean necessarily fiduciary boards. I mean, it's boards who are set up to tackle a particular challenge, a particular issue. So cross-breeding becomes one of the things that's important. I won't give all of the background on because it's too long of a narrative to talk about, but there are efforts out there like the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion was started by PwC, and they call other corporations And Tim Ryan did a fantastic job of putting that together. And I think it's still going on. I'm sure it is because his passion is very deep on that. I see JP Morgan Chase doing a great job for that as well. They're reaching into public sectors to drive agendas as well. So I see that happening. And still, there's so much more to do. Okay, particularly when it comes down to public policy. So corporations are trying to affect it. I was watching CNBC just yesterday, and a couple of CEOs by chance were talking about their public policy as it relates to this, and even COVID-19 and the effects that it's having on disproportionately having on certain communities over others, and how that is impacting their employee base, et cetera. So I think it's happening. The question is, pulling aside, how to make it more viral, how to make it more lingering, how to make it more urgent. And I'm going to turn to the young folks of Harvard and others like them. You got to go demand it. You got to go ask for it. You got to go and beat the banner. You got to go and be someone who's willing to learn and make mistakes and make adjustments. But don't give up the argument. Don't give up the fight just because you lose a battle. Just keep pressing. So I'm intrigued by the fact that you have a group of students now who are interested in this subject matter. And I'm very interested to hear their questions directly.
Yep. So Katie, we'll turn it over.
Awesome. So if we have any students in the seminar who would like to ask a question, now would be a great time to raise your hand. Great. And I'm seeing a few also sort of like sentiments being shared in the chat box, but I'll let the class ask some questions and then I'll go to those. Okay. So if you're the first student I saw raise your hand, I'm unmuting you now.
Thank you. Hi there. Thanks so much
Hi.
for this. So I have a question specifically about the private sector, and I'm thinking specifically about financial institutions and corporate. I think for many graduating students, we are trying to strike a balance between what our values are and actually supporting ourselves. And I think entering into the private sector, it's a competitive market, and I think it is also a path to self-sustainability. And I think a lot of the time there's pressure, right, to hide one's personal politics or values just to get through the door. And so I appreciate what you're saying about young folks and those who are entering the job market sort of marching with that banner. And at the same time, I think there are some cultural pressures to conform a little bit more or not necessarily have that at the first interview. And so I'm wondering, given that perspective, what you think about pushing for that type of change when companies are really altering their approach based on what they perceive the talent pool to want out of a company.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And I do recognize that it's a bit daunting to walk into an established enterprise and say, these are my beliefs right at the gate. And there are going to be moments when, in fact, it's going to be a perfect time to do it. And it's just looking for those moments. What all companies are, and particularly in the private sector, is when they bring in a new class of talent, that they basically do something where they bring all the talent together and give them mutual experiences. And in coming out of that, usually the leadership of a company will come and want to meet with that group. And they would talk about how you're feeling and what's going on. And invariably in that session, there's going to be a moment in time where you can broach something of this nature. Okay, and it's just selective. Okay, and you know when the time is right to actually go there. Additionally, when you start and you're working with your direct manager, that's one of the most important relationships you can have within the company, because your direct manager will make all the assessments on how you're doing. Developing a relationship with that direct manager and then the boss of that direct manager becomes critical. And then you will find the moment to have that conversation as well. The way I think about those two people, and then I would want to be brief and allow others to ask questions as well, is I started thinking later about that as my direct boss was my parent. And parents are critical by nature. Their real purpose is to make sure that you're safe, to make sure you do everything that you should be doing exactly what you should be doing. The boss of that direct manager, I start viewing them as a grandparent. And my grandparents allowed me to eat cake for breakfast. They allowed me to take all these risks. They allowed me to cross streets that my parents wouldn't let me cross, etc. They basically nurtured my soul. So understanding relationships that you have with your management team, those who will nurture your soul and allow you to ask open-ended questions like this, to tell them who you are, versus a parent who basically want to know, make sure that you're doing math when you're supposed to be doing math, that you're eating your peas at the right time, etc. They are less likely to, that person with that profile is less likely to explore with you the possibilities of your soul. So it's just finding your analogy, this is my analogy, finding your way to address different sets of people at the right time to bring your point across. So it's solving the puzzle, not thinking about it, that you're going to crash the puzzle, but how did you, in fact, put together steps, intentional steps to get after what you ultimately want to have accomplished. That's how you go about it.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Awesome, thanks. And our next question is coming from Maria. Maria, I'm unmuting you now.
Hi, William.
Hi, Maria.
Thanks for being with us today. I have a question regarding like issues that arise when diversity confronts values of the organization. For instance, I read some stuff about class migrants, and I've also been working with a group of young people that come from different class backgrounds. And I often stumble upon issues of like how class also defines different definitions of success, and of how like overwork and like different working hours is understood by families and individuals of different class backgrounds, and how sometimes organizations that are led by people from a certain class background, usually affluent, expect employees to work and behave with a certain set of values that could be limiting to like welcoming and including people from lower class backgrounds, like low socioeconomic status, into the organization. And I find that this is a very hard square to circle, and I would love to hear your opinion on this.
Yeah, it is a very difficult place, right? In particular right now in a climate that we're in today, okay, where you see certain officials, and I'll stay away from all the politics of it all, but if you think about diversity, the times that we're living in right now is not necessarily helpful from a diversity angle. The way that people are segmenting themselves, and they're being not necessarily intentionally encouraged, but there's encouragement for positions that basically gets to isolationism. Therefore, it makes it difficult. And when you come inside of a company, the same people that you see on the outside, those people are on the inside of the company walls as well. So it does create this feeling of a landmine. And particularly as you now layer onto that immigrations and all the other things, is that language, all these things that make you who you are, it makes it more difficult for you to feel instantly at home inside of a company. And I completely understand that. And finding your way to cluster into a group, either inside of work or outside of work, that using affinity teams or human resource teams or whatever it is, to cluster together in a way to say, am I crazy? Okay, I'm feeling this way about this particular item. Are you feeling that way as well? And then talking about how do we collectively find a way to tackle something that's really egregious versus something that's just a pain. Okay, the egregious points come together and then find a way how to address it. Make it known. If your company has employee surveys, answer those things truthfully, because those are the barometers that companies use to, in fact, gauge how groups of people are feeling about any subject matter. And so often I find folks reluctant to actually say the truth on those surveys because they're afraid that it can be traced back to them. And for privacy reasons, for a whole host of privacy reasons, you never have to fear that those things being traced back to you, because bad things happen within a corporation if that happens. So truth in those surveys becomes your way to talk through and speak up about those things that are truly egregious, that's not acceptable, that you can't get through. But I do want to acknowledge and recognize right now is one of those times where the pressures that you just talked about are in fact real. So if I was in your group, I would say you have every right to feel this discomfort that you're expressing. However, you also have the voice and the obligation to cluster around a group of folks that you can amplify that, to bring that forth. Because you cannot allow, and I can tell by the way that you ask your question, you cannot allow it to go unaddressed. Last point is, recognize that that's happening across all companies. So while some companies may seemingly be better at it, trust me when I say they all are dealing with it. Because they're all dealing with people, and people right now are struggling with this whole idea. The very last point. When I think about diversity, and this was one of the pre-questions, I think about diversity first as biological. I'll talk about DNA. That's the most elementary form of diversity. Beyond that is identity. How do you identify? Okay, what's in it about you that leads you to say, I connect with this group of people, I don't necessarily connect with another group of people, so identity. The next one is social and cultural. You just spoke to some of the social and cultural dynamics. That's that's next up on the ladder. And then economic, you spoke to that as well, because social, cultural, and the other piece feeds into economic depression. Okay. And then there's structural. I talked about it from terms of how a company puts itself together, enterprise puts itself together. Those are different layers of diversity. Try to find your way of stratifying them, and then understand how you're going to assemble to, in fact, tackle it. It looks great where you are, by the way. So.
Yeah, the scenery there is much better than in Cambridge, wearing a hat, have the heater on. So just to give you folks the lay of the land, I'm next going to call on Ghadeer, and then I have a question from the chat box that I'll share with you, and then we'll go to Chu. So Ghadeer, I'm unmuting you now.
Hi, Katie. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Yeah, we saw Ghadeer at the WAP open house yesterday.
William, it has been wonderful. I'm not a young chick. Let's put it this way. I have at least about 30 years of experience under my belt. And so I do understand a lot of the things that happened. And being an Arab American and a Muslim, I can tell you I went through God knows what. I mean, there's the beginning at that time, being young, was me being seen like, why don't you want to conform to what Arab and Muslim women need to be? Why are you being outspoken? Why are you asking a lot of tough questions? So it took me a lot of time, a lot of beating on my head to understand when and how to approach topics. However, at this age, and I'm in my 50s now, and all I can say is one of the topics that is still unaddressed, and people, it's not necessarily in the developing countries as much as it's, in the Western region as well, which is the diversity for me is a lot more basic before skin color and different nationalities and ethnicities coming into it. It is, for me, men versus women. The diversity in top management or in job opportunities for women, and not to be seen as secretaries or junior assistants or, all that stuff. Because I can tell you, even at this grand age, I would walk into meetings and people would assume I'm the junior assistant or stuff, and I would be the strategist. My question to you, which is a little bit more on a personal level as a man, and your take on this is, how do we teach and approach, senior management males in particular, to relate to this part of diversity? What will make them more comfortable from your perspective as a male to say, well, you know what, we need to do more, and don't brush it off and say, yeah, or yeah, we've taken this level of measurement of women being included, but if you look around at what positions there are, like, seriously, I have qualified women, who can do this. And one of the things I've done personally over the past few years, which gives me comfort, age is fantastic, especially have all the gray hairs in your head, is people kind of like sit and listen to you, is I say to gentlemen, and it's easier to do that, especially with men I know personally, is when when I open this topic, is I tell them, if you truly care for me, or you say you care about your mother, your sister, cousin, aunt, whatever it is, show it. Do you actually promote equality with women, and diversity in senior positions at your job? Because each of you, it's not the concept that it has to come from, government or very senior people in certain areas. That's not true. All of you are ambassadors to promoting our ability to join you at the big table as well. So my question is to you, from your experience, and I absolutely love your experience and your wisdom, is how would you at this stage, if that was your daughter talking with you, how would you tell her how to approach this?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question, and expressing the difficulty, because it's real. Okay, so it's real. When I speak about gender, there's a couple of things I want to acknowledge. One is, it is an emotional topic for women, is not necessarily an emotional topic for men. Okay, and making it emotional for them becomes the way in. Okay, so you talked about making it personal, making it emotional that way. The advantage that women have versus some of the other groups that you mentioned is, if you're a man, you have a relationship with a woman somewhere. It's unavoidable. You have a relationship with a woman someplace. So whether it's your mom, whether it's your sister, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your kids, you have a relationship. And if you can, in fact, connect with that man, so I'm going to an individual male, on that personal level, then you can, in fact, begin to create change. And one of the big ways, so let's talk about the professional set, because it's different with the professional set versus the skill set. Okay, so the professional set, if you can connect with a man on that level and get him to imagine, hopefully, his daughter, and what he envisions for his daughter, you will find that if you do it in the right angle, you can capture their emotions. And then you can see, the Prince of Saudi teaching his daughter how to drive, because somehow she made that impression on him. So you can begin to unravel it once you get down to making it emotional for men the way that you properly articulate it. And the pathway in is going to be different for different men. For me, as a male, the way that I talk to other men about it is my impatience with our not getting this right sooner. That the excuses that we've had, I call on no longer accepting the excuses that we give to one another. Like, there's not enough women. Absolutely, that's not true. That women, in fact, don't want to do this work, they want to stay home. That's not true. Okay, so I call on men to erase those excuses, those crushes that we've had, because I'm tired of dealing with the subject. I'm tired of not seeing progress being made. So I use anger to get them emotional as a man. You cannot do that as a woman.
No.
So it is, in fact, how do you unlock emotion and passion with them? The way that a man will unlock that emotion and passion is to call them out. And I enjoy calling them out. Okay. How you unlock their emotion is that you find an emotional hook that they cannot deny, and you move them on that accord. If you get more men calling more men out, then you begin to see progress. But I do want to say, the progress of women, and there are two communities where there's been more global progress than any other groups. It has been women, and it has been LGBTQ. And I'm proud of both of those things. Okay. So there has been an exponential growth in those two accords. The slowest growth for women has been towards the top of corporations. But in government, you see women moving a lot faster into governmental roles in certain countries, in certain cultures. The last point, from a Muslim standpoint, I've lived 2 years in Singapore. I've worked probably half of my career in Asia and through the Middle East. And there are some success stories there that they're worth sharing. Like In Saudi, we have women working in plants on all 3 shifts. In India, the same is true. But you have to put things in place to get first the government and then the households of these women comfortable with them actually doing that thing. So now there are women who run plants. They're the plant manager, and most of the folks in the plant are men. Okay. So you do see some progress, but like you, I'm frustrated because this is something that should have been solved a long time ago. And I get impatient when we use the excuses that there's not enough of them, there's not enough interest, their skills don't match men, they have home duties, etc. I get impatient because I have a daughter, I have 6 sisters, as I said, and frankly, the folks who were better than me were usually women. So.
And just to add to that, one of the things that I had a very interesting concept, confrontation with when you at work, was the blindness to the topic of inequality, for example, in pay between men and women. And when I bring that up, people think I'm a little bit crazy. They're like, no. I'm like, well, I wish they would, like what the UK has done over the past few years, is disclose all the salaries.
Correct.
But we can't get there. I mean, that would be something, at least it will, in my opinion, it intimidated entities to not offer the same salary for the same qualifications for the same job. But would that something you think moving forward we should ask for?
Yes,
transparency.
And there's a huge movement, and there's more data that's becoming more transparent. More companies are beginning to publish their information and put it in the public domain. But I talked about not competing. This is one of those data sets that folks used to compete on. But also from a legal standpoint, they see it as a risk. So the argument becomes, are you at risk of discovery? And are you protected by exposure? Okay, and if you can get that thing balanced, then you can begin to get more of the facts. And the last piece on that too is, it's not just about pay for equal skills. It's about area under the curve. So it's how long a man has been in the role. Because what we don't account for in that analysis is, if a man is in a role longer, then the area on the curve, he's been paid higher for a long period of time. And it's that part that now makes it generationally hard for women to catch up, because they've lost so much of their wealth because they weren't in those roles earlier and longer.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to mash together a few of the questions that I've seen come through in the chat, and they all sort of circle around the same topic of power and of transformative change. There's one about D&I, meaning sort of folks on the top incurring somewhat of a loss of power, both personal and economic. And if you have any advice on how that was treated in your own experience or places where you've seen that go well. And I also saw one talking about organizations being really feeling satisfied with the perception of being diverse and tokenism, but not actually being diverse. And how do you get past that obstacle?
The tokenism side of it, there are going to be 2 sides to that, right? One side is that an organization is playing in that game, but then you find that there are groups of employees who don't want to link diversity to their reason for success. So they basically become more tentative in voicing it. In fact, they would like the company no longer to even deal with the subject matter of diversity, believing that we stop talking about it, we'll make more progress. Okay, so you have those 2 forces that's out there. The idea of it all, though, is to again shape an argument that in fact can move a particular person or a particular group at a particular time. And there isn't a universal thing here because of the sheer nature of what it's about. Okay. So when I think about this idea of how do you, in fact, get after that question, I believe the answer is always going to lie in the space of, how do I fashion an argument that actually motivate a group of people to, in fact, do something different? So for some groups of people towards the end of my career, the argument for me became, as a leader who's been entrusted with an organization, we have recruited a population of people because they were the best. and we bring them in. So let's blind it and say this is a group of people. Now let's track them through, let's just say, the first 3 levels of movement. And then you break them out at the end of that 3 levels of movement, and you say, where are the populations now? Where are diverse groups of people, and what does it look like? Then the onus becomes, that I put it on, is the leadership. And I ask the question of, if you were a coach of an athlete, of an athletic team, do you think you can retain your job if, in fact, you are not good at developing this group of people equally? Because the issue of diversity and the issue of talent development, isn't talent development your responsibility? So either tell me that you're not good at developing women, that you cannot develop them equally as you can develop men, and then we can make another call on you and your ability, but you can no longer tell me that they're not capable of succeeding, because see, here's the metrics that said they look better in a lot of regards than the men or any other demographic group that you have. So is it your inability to develop? And then you teach them how to coach and how to develop, because now they're interested in showing up their skill set. As I talk about that example, it's just a way to, what is the exact problem that's hindering your ability to make progress? Don't look for a universal bomb that you can drop and everything is going to be solved by. Define the isolated problem that you're trying to solve for, and then create a solution for that problem. Think through it, and then impart an experiment and see if the experiment works, because the experiment will have application in certain situations. What I just talked about, holding managers responsible for the development of their organization, and diversity is something I expect you to be good at developing, has led into some incredible progression, but also ownership by people who otherwise didn't see it as their problem. Now it is your problem because you can't coach and develop people equally. That's a problem for you. It's not their problem, it's your problem. Okay. That will lead men to take action.
Great. Thank you so much. And the next question is from Chu. Chu, thank you so much for your patience on this. I'm unmuting you now.
Yeah, hi, William. Thank you so much for joining and not just giving us practical examples like the reverse fishbowl, but also very inspirational about how we can go and enact social change. My question is, having worked in the private sector, I've seen a lot of resources dedicated to it for D&I, and what I've seen is laterally, it's become more inclusive of various groups. But then also vertically, it's been inclusive of more intersectional groups. So you have the LGBTQ umbrella, and within that, you might have a trans group or a bisexual group. So it's getting more depth, but also more breadth. Mm-hmm. And my question is, how do you think about diversity and inclusion in that sense? Because it's easy for people to say, look, as you expand the breadth of diversity, my geographic diversity or my education background or my previous work experiences are all diversity. And that's an argument I've heard a lot from the dominant group to say, look, we can't just look at LGBTQ or people of color or indigenous diversity. There's so many other types of diversity out there. So I'm curious to know, how do you conceptualize it, and how have you seen best practices across the industry do that?
Yeah, it's one of those places where you will see some highly educated people, some of them on the East Coast of where you guys are, talking about the reason why we're not doing better is because we keep talking about it. So why don't we just do away with all of that, and using Rodney King's famous quote, why can't we all get along, in hopes of it all just washing away. And the way that I continue to think about it again is there are certain things within our survival mechanism in our DNA that forces us to assimilate ourselves with people who are like us. There's safety in numbers. Zebra, or herd of zebra, look alike to us intentionally from their DNA coding, so that we can't distinguish and isolate one, because they basically want to escape the lion. So when they're fleeing, they're hopeful that the lion will pick another one and not me. Flamingos, all species do that to a herd mentality. Is not to identify from a position of strength, is actually to protect you from isolationism. So if you become distinguishedly different from someone else, you basically set yourself up to be more selected and more visible to an outside group. So assimilation works because of that. With that being the basis for it all, trying to force groups together basically says that you are trying to sugarcoat the whole issue, and you're not getting down to the fundamental issues that we have. So the way that I stacked my definition is not anything other than William Gibson's definition of biological differences. For me, is the fundamental root of the issue, and that shows up at how do we look. Okay, that's the most evident item that people can begin to single us out based on the way that we look. Okay, and then on top of that, then you begin to layer in all the other differences there. Some of the groups that you mentioned as well have to be very careful because they can become the most divisive group of all. Okay, I chastise in good ways, but very pointed ways, the LGBTQ community. I mean, they can be very harsh and brutal to one another. Okay, for the differences that you talked about. Within gender, women can also be very brutal to one another. Okay, if you are a woman of color, a white woman may not even recognize you. Okay, and they basically can brutalize you unintentionally and sometimes intentionally. So clustering women together has its place, and then it has some very serious scars that they need to work their way through. So each of the groups can in fact begin to do that. I lived in Latin America for 7 years, and there are some long-running differences between certain groups of people in Latin America that you just don't overcome automatically. And when we cluster them together and say that you're Latin, that doesn't necessarily mean that they get along. Only the West classifies all of Asia as Asia. Okay, there are distinct differences that have existed for centuries that you get into, and then you go into a country like Japan, you see the stratification of different people from the mountain regions versus etc. So the point of all that is that diversity is a very complex thing. It deals with this idea of, am I extracting full value from the folks and the talents that's around me? Can I acknowledge where I'm biased and therefore take steps, intentional steps, to guard against my bias having an effect on that person in a unhelpful, unproductive way? Am I ready to recognize that I do have tendencies that I can sometimes be blinded by, and I'm vulnerable enough and I expose myself enough that makes it okay for you to come and say, hey, what did you mean by that? This is how I interpreted what you said. Can you explain to me a little bit more what you meant by that? Okay, that I'm willing to go to that second and third level of conversation, and that I don't guard it today just because I said so. Okay, so it's that level of human interaction that you just have to work through. But I'm always guarded when people say, can we just roll it all up and just deal with it collectively? Because the folks within that collective are not experiencing the same things at the same time. And we're denying it if we believe that that's true. Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that good? Katie, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up.
That sounds great. Do you want me to have them both go at the same time and William can answer them at once? Okay,
yes.
Awesome. All right, so the 2 questions we have will be Evelyn and then Rayma. Evelyn, I'm unmuting you now.
Hi, William.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being with us today. So I feel a little bad because this week is supposed to be like LGBTQ week, and we just had a very great session on Tuesday. So I hate to be asking this question because someone brought this up earlier. I don't think she is here anymore. But we were talking about earlier how you were. How for you to get men into conversations about no longer discriminating women and helping women out and empowering women, you are making the topic of female empowerment emotional. And I wonder if that is that might be necessary, but I wonder if that is sufficient, because they might get emotional about caring about women, but if their way of caring about women is that they need to protect them instead of empower them. So like if their thought is like, for a woman to be successful, like she needs to get married, or like she needs to, instead of learning math, she needs to learn how to bake. So if they have these like patriarchal and quite misogynistic assumptions about what it would be, like what a woman needs to be or what a woman needs to do to be successful and empowered in the world, I worry that their way of caring about women will carry on, and they will pass it on to the women that they know and their daughters and their sisters. So like I worry about not correcting their sexist assumptions and just making the topic emotional. So I wanted to hear your response to that. And I know like we're running out of time, but I wanted to also ask you that I'm from South Korea, and LGBTQ issues are just not a thing in South Korea. Like we don't, like a lot of people don't believe that gays are real. Like it's a lot of really offensive things that I don't want to like say out loud. So as a person interested in D&I, I wonder about these like basic strategies that I can tap into, that I can acquire from you, so that I can start these conversation about LGBTQ, let alone just let them know that like it's a real thing. So like those are my two questions.
Okay, so in the interest of expediency, on the question of emotion.
Oh, I'm sorry. One point. We should go ahead and get Rima's question, just because that was, and then you can pick and choose, William, which ones you feel you have time to answer. Katie, can we unmute Rima?
Yep. Rima, you're unmuted now.
Hi, thank you very much, William, for this. It's a great conversation. Very quickly, as we've seen in the media, 75% of the people at the front line are women, and the number of also the statistics on how much the women are earning as compared to the men is really shocking. So as we navigate COVID-19, for me, the question is, how can we make diversity and inclusion more effective by also including in equity, looking at either the people who are losing jobs, the people who are dying, and everything is showing the race, the gender inequalities, the income inequalities. How can we make really this into, as we think through in the future, how can we make it more meaningful than it is right now?
Okay. Let me try to combine these questions somewhat, although they're different. Okay, so I'm going to start with your question first, and then I'll get to the earlier questions. How do we make it more effective in these times? You're right. The numbers are clearly favoring women in terms of numbers. Okay, so most of the percentages are moving in favor of women. Graduation rates, higher degrees, postgraduate degrees, most of that is moving in favor of women. So women are, in fact, getting into the workforce, the leadership role, the potential for leadership roles more abundantly than ever before. So there is a pivot point that's going to be down the line, okay, and it's beginning to happen now. So I talked about the pace of progression in terms of absolute number for women is one of the fastest moving paces of any other group of people. Okay. And what we're talking about now is how do they now take advantage of the power that's there? So what is that collective thing that they want to get done? And I also talked about how bringing together women to recognize that they are themselves at times excluding groups of women, that they're not allowing all of the groups of women's voices to come through. So people like Catalyst, which is a women's organization, they're trying to take on this idea of women of color and how Catalysts have inadvertently kept them from being considered in the mix. Okay, so women have to hold themselves accountable for doing exactly the thing that they want men to be accountable for, which is including all kinds of women and making sure that those voices are being heard. Make sure that they're doing a great job of nurturing and caring for women. Because in some of the relationships, and I'm just calling it the way it is, some of the harshest relationships with women have been with other women. because they become judgmental and they use a high bar of expectation even beyond what men have, because they believe, unfortunately, that the failure of one woman means the failure of all women. So they're very harsh. The thing that they talk about bringing into the workforce is more of a nurturing environment, when in fact they're not necessarily calling each other on their behaviors. So women have the responsibility to, in fact, to make sure that they lead by example with other women, what they're expecting from men, because the numbers are in fact moving in their favor. So it does not mean that they're giving men a bye, because the things that I talked about, which I'm going to address now, the idea of the emotional connection with men, I didn't mean to imply that it's emotion for the sake of emotion. The question, as I was trying to answer, was how do you in fact connect with men in a way that they can begin to want to get into the work of making things better for women? And I talked about it, get them from an emotional angle. Okay? And the emotional angle can vary based on who the man is. It is by no means to say that now they need to placate or speak down to or have ideas that basically chauvinistically direct one. That is not the idea, because that's another emotional conversation that will happen if they do that. But it's just, how do you in fact open their minds to the possibility that they have a role to play? And I'm just accepting of the fact that whenever someone transforms themselves from being who they used to be to doing something different, emotion always was the catalyst that led them to do it. That's how you see people who spoke against LGBTQ rights. They found that they had a kid or a brother or sister or someone else who in fact finally came out, and they cared so much about this person that they now changed their whole position on it. And you see that happening politically, in corporations, in clerical situations, all the time. So emotion is the way that we transform ourselves, but it's not to be emotional. It's in fact to use emotion to in fact invoke change. That was the point of that. And the last one on LGBTQ and the impact in Korea. South Korea is not alone in its belief that it doesn't exist. There are lots of countries out there who believe that it doesn't exist. And that's what they say publicly. But then underneath it all, we all know that it exists in every freaking country. Okay. So the idea of sharing best practices, there are companies in South Korea, just to isolate to South Korea, that are doing a much better job there. And there are allies that I have in South Korea that works for Proctor, who in fact are doing some great things in the offices there, trying to create more of an awareness and a movement. So there is an LGBTQ, as we call, Procter & Gamble calls it their Gable organization. Gays, so Gable is an acronym for LGBTQ within the company, that in fact you can utilize and go after, and I'll be more than happy to connect to that group if you have an interest. So send me an email and I'll make the connection.
Wonderful. So can everyone understand now why I invited William Gibson to speak? And could everyone see that wisdom that I talked about earlier? Fantastic discussion. Thank you, William, for taking time out of your seaside retirement, because he's in sunny South Florida on the beach, and he took time out to have this conversation with us around his experiences in D&I around the world. I didn't realize you lived on so many continents, but it was good to see a global perspective as well to this subject. And for all of the WAP attendees, we're going to have our final seminar of the week. Next week, we have Lumumba Seegers from the Harvard Business School, who's going to speak to us about Sanctioned Radicals, a comparative study of collective organizing around race versus gender inside of organizations. I hope to see everyone there. Same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you very much, William. Enjoy the rest of your evening and your weekend. And everyone, I wish you the same. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.